My name is Nathan Allen, and I'm going to talk to you about intellectual property regulation and China. So, first things first, my field of study is business administration, and I have a minor in legal studies. The journal I chose to write for was the University of Pennsylvania Law School Business Law Journal, so it perfectly encompasses both my major and my minor. The first part of the assignment was the writing conventions checklist, so I included quite a few points from that original assignment, but left a few out that weren't necessarily relevant to this presentation. It was written in, the journal was written in ABA with superscript numbers leading to citations in the footnotes. Um, I wrote an APA to go along with the requirements of this assignment, um, but the original journal was written in ABA. There's lots of references on every little detail, but they are rarely quoted directly. Um, they usually just allude to information and then tell you where they got it. Formal diction with academic focus. It was written in single columns with footnotes divided from the content by a bolded line. The target audience is business and legal professionals, students, or academics. The article addresses a specific issue, but are sometimes left open ended so that the concepts can be applied to many different businesses. They used a highly professional tone, and even open ended examples are backed up by specific cases or case studies to show that the principles they're talking about are actually useful. There are sometimes graphs or illustrations, but only if it's necessary to actually understand the content, never just filler. Everything must be backed by fact or case law, and arguments must be carefully and clearly developed. The, the articles are usually written in the current perspective, mostly because the articles address issues in today's context, so they typically don't hit on things from the past. It's assumed that the reader has an understanding of the current legal community. The primary and secondary sources are both used in the article, and I reflected that in my paper as well. Concise and to the point sentences. You only say what you need to say in the field of law most of the time. The table of contents also had headings later on, or subheadings anyway, and they were usually bolded, so I chose to imitate that in my paper too, just to kind of give it the same organization, and it looks nicer. The introductions explain the context of the issue and almost always state the thesis in the last sentence. I actually didn't do that in my paper just because we had to do an abstract at the beginning, which is basically the same thing, but in the Penn Law Journal, they do an introduction right before the table of contents, actually. The conclusions restate the thesis and review what was said in the body, and then they make the final conclusion of the argument. So a lot of times people say that you should never have new information in a conclusion, but in this case, they actually reach their conclusion in the conclusion. So it's very logical, and I chose to do the same thing. So I did present some new information at the end and eventually pointed out the final argument I was trying to make. So this is from the article proposal assignment that we did, which had 4 different parts to it. So the first 2 are on this slide, and then the next 2 are the next slide. The description and justification. The topic I would like to discuss in my journal article is China's theft on American intellectual property. That's just a quote from my assignment. So the reason that it needs to be discussed further than that, further than just the fact that China steals American intellectual property, is that when cases cross international lines, they often get more complicated because culturally our system of ethics doesn't apply to other places. So we can't force other countries to play by our rules. The specific research question that I used was, what is the root of our disagreement with China, and why is this happening? This is happening right now, and it's affecting the American and global economy. There were 2 caveats on that part of the assignment that wanted us to explain why it's relevant to people that might be reading, and then it's relevant to me in my field of study because it's a legal issue that affects business and economics. My tentative main claim, which ended up being my final main claim as well, is that the root of the issue is the context in which our separate governments were formed. Because our economies were founded on different philosophies, we value different things. and then I went on to explain the principles that America was formed upon, so our Constitution, essentially, and then China's perspective in their context, which was communism. And I highlighted the differences between the two philosophies and how that affects the theft of intellectual property. Um, just a quick summary of my annotated bibliography. Most of the information is relatively conceptual. I'm sorry, most information is relatively conceptual with specific facts used to back it up. So the concepts and main points were taken from journal articles written about similar topics, and then more trivial type things, dates, names, specific examples. Those things came from reliable sources still, but not necessarily academic journals. So, for example, the contexts and the philosophies that I used and the points that I used to develop my arguments would come from academic journals, but if I wanted to cite a specific case, one that I used happened to be about trust busting and Theodore Roosevelt. I used that information from just historical websites and that type of thing. So not academic journals, but definitely sources that would be accurate. So I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough of what's actually in the paper. So it's very contextual because that ultimately ended up being my main thesis. So first I talked about the perspective of the United States and went through the original economic idea behind free market capitalism and how we were founded on that. So essentially, intellectual property is an issue because we were founded on the idea that consumers and manufacturers should be the ones to set prices, not the government. But unfortunately, if there's no competition, then manufacturers will just by the nature of things be able to set the price to whatever they want, which is why we had the entire trust busting initiative with President Roosevelt. And on the flip side, if there is unlimited competition where anybody can make anything they want and steal ideas, that will not allow businesses to succeed because as soon as anybody creates a product, somebody else will just take it, and they can't possibly turn a profit or sell enough of something if everybody is selling that same thing. So that's where intellectual property rights come from, and that's what the United States believes in. It's all based on free market capitalism. On the other hand, China was formed, well, not formed, they've been around a lot longer than we have, but modern China was communist, and that's where their constitution came from. They had a constitution that was implemented in 1984, and if you can look on this graph here, that's right before this little dotted red line here is the manufacturing output for China. So this is when they really took off there. That was their industrial revolution. So in 1984, right before the industrial revolution, when their constitution was created, they were still communist, and they did not necessarily believe in any sort of free market economics. So everything was government controlled. They didn't need people to worry about stealing ideas because you did what the government told you to do anyway. So now that they're competing in a global market with countries like us, the United States, it's become an issue because they have no regard for respecting our property when we introduce our products over there. So that's why you can go to China and buy a fake Rolex, or as demonstrated in this picture right here, this one at the top is a Chinese car, which is a blatant copy of a Mini Cooper right here. So that would be a German design that they stole, but the example is still pretty clear. So the next section of my paper was titled Two Incompatible Nations Working Together, right here, and that's where it went on to explain that it explains what the problem actually is today. So now we've worked from context up to the here and now. So the issue is that China is estimated to steal about $360 billion worth of intellectual property from the United States alone every year, which is a big problem for us because China is a huge market. It's 20% of the entire world population wise. So now that they're finally industrializing themselves, they're buying things and they're shaping the new global economy. Um, we've all heard Donald Trump talk about China and how important they are to the global economy. So we want to kind of work into that market, and that can help everything become more cohesive and um, really prosper. Additionally, now that so many extra people, an extra 20% of Earth is industrialized, they're requiring more raw materials. So, third world countries that maybe produce coal or they come up with cotton for textiles and that kind of stuff are benefiting from it too as well because they're not only selling things, China, they're also buying things. So this is good for our economy, and we want to work with them, but unfortunately, it's a lot more difficult than we thought just because of the context. And then the final conclusion is what I've kind of already alluded to, just that um, the root behind the problem is just that our nations were formed on two completely separate principles, and China has industrialized kind of out of the typical order of operations. In England, who began the Industrial Revolution, that's where it all started. Adam Smith published his book, The Wealth of Nations, who, and that's where the original economic principle of laissez-faire came about, and hands-off government and everything that the United States was also based off of. But China didn't have any of that before their Industrial Revolution. So they don't have the same ethical beliefs as us, and that's why we have issues, and that's the conclusion of the paper. So moving right along, explanation of the writing process. So this came pretty naturally to me just because it's a topic that I'm interested in. I'm a senior business major, and I've talked about intellectual property stuff in international markets quite a bit in class, but I'm also going to law school in the fall, and I hope to study intellectual property. So this is a topic near and dear to my heart per se. So I chose to write it just because it's something that I know about and that I care about, which ended up probably being the best strength of this paper. It seems pretty obvious, actually. You look around at books and everything, nonfiction books, and why would an author write about something that they don't actually know anything about? So it makes a lot of sense. So that was pretty reaffirming as well, because I was able to learn a lot about academic journals and what they are and how they are useful. I hadn't really used that type of stuff before. In English 1 at my university, we called it College Writing 1. We talked a lot about reliable sources and that sort of thing, but never academic journals. So that was kind of a new world that I was introduced to, which in turn expanded my research skills. I finally learned how to write an APA. I always thought it was a joke that you kind of have to learn MLA in high school, but most people go on to learn APA anyway. So I was able to learn how to do that. This was the first paper that I had to write in APA officially. A lot of business papers are kind of free of a format I found throughout college. The professor will give you a format that they want you to follow, so it's not necessarily APA or anything really. And then lastly, I learned that I honestly enjoy writing when it's about a topic that I like, which is a good thing because I liked writing this paper genuinely, which means I must enjoy the topic that I was writing about. And that's a good thing because I'm about to graduate, so that would be bad if I didn't like this topic. So that's all I've got for you. Thanks for listening. See you on the forum.